So I'm actually gonna start with Andy and Sammy since they've both been at ARM together. So can you talk more about how OSPOs are created and then how they are usually set up within organizations?
Sure. So the ARM has been dipping its toe in open source over a number of years in the past, and it was very much a mismatched hodgepodge attempt at trying to do the right thing. Right? The intent was there, great, but the delivery of the intent was somewhat lacking. And so it was around the time that pretty much most of the industry would acknowledge that open source is taking over the world, but we need to do it in the right way, right fashion. And so we created Open Source Office at ARM to try and align the various engineering organizations within the company to ensure that standard process, standard procedures, we do things the right way, understand licensing aspects, make sure our legal team fully understood the various impacts of the different aspects of licenses, etc., and ensure that the engineers had that support and knowledge to be able to comfortably participate in open source, whether it be in existing projects, creating new projects, etc. So that's kind of how, certainly at ARM, we came about creating the Open Source Office.
To that, as Dawn mentioned, I've been involved in the Open Chain initiative since 2014, 2015 at the very beginning. And I think I would say, in general, certainly 5-6 years ago, establishing open source offices was more a voluntary type function. Individuals within an organization who had interactions and responsibilities around doing certain things relating either to general IP licensing or open source or software licensing, plus engineers who are developing and are experienced in their specific fields, and wanting to do certain things, but finding that it's actually been quite inefficient and inconsistent across an organization. And just to elaborate on what Andy said, within ARM, actually there was it's made up of 6-7 different business units and groups who were all trying to do the right thing, but just inconsistent, and there wasn't that sort of general governance or guidance that establishes that consistency across. Whether it's legal side, whether it's in the engineering side, all of it was actually people had the good intent, but just that inconsistency. And that's certainly the story I hear from a lot of counterparts and friends in other companies. It's just that collection of people who cared about open source and wanted to streamline the way things are done to make it easier to either adopt open source or to contribute to open source projects.
Maybe I can get you to talk more about the role of an OSPO in shaping an organization's internal culture while also representing that organization's open source work to the external world.
Yeah, I've really for the last 15 years, we've been working in Asia in particular to take best practices from Europe and the US to be able to inculcate the notion that an OSPO was very much necessary in order to support something very important that I think we don't pay enough attention to, which is truly putting in place a governance program that supports compliance at a high level. And I think we leave ourselves exposed to the fact that by virtue of the fact that we're not in compliance, most companies are not in compliance if you look at them at any moment in time. And I think that that gives rise to a sense of concern among the people that really Sammy's talking about, that are the people who have driven the open source movement. And you look at companies like Hitachi, they've had for 16 years an OSPO, NEC for 12 years. I think these organizations looked at what was happening and they tried to make sense of what was the best practice. So the people who really understood it, I think we have a great example at Microsoft. Microsoft came to this party late, but they basically went all in to make sure that the program office, which is larger than a program office that Sarah runs, is really much more than just an OSPO. It's about compliance, it's about governance, it's about interaction, it's about education all across the company. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, on any of this. But it's also an external kind of communicator. I think a lot of companies still don't understand. If you talk to marketing and sales, you talk to the groups that are not developing technology, they still don't understand the role of open source in their company. And this can be, maybe at Google they do, because they were born in open source. Meta was born in open source. AWS was born in open source. But if you look at traditional companies, there's still pockets where people need to be socialized the message of how important open source is to the products and services that are being sold out into the market. And I think, what we see from some of the Asian companies, you look at Huawei. Huawei is an incredibly buttoned down compliance and governance, has an incredibly buttoned down program, because they have made it their point to look at best practices and to basically, we established something called the Asian Legal Network for the primary purpose of sharing best practices so that Asian companies could catch up quickly. And they've not only caught up, but I think they are exceeding some of the companies in the West that have taken a more laissez-faire approach to setting up an OSPO. And I think it's building a culture, it's disseminating information, and it's recognizing that we not only have, through this great opportunity that we have in open source, we have obligations. And those obligations are to manage our licenses well, and from an OIN standpoint, to recognize that in an increasingly open source centric world, we have patent obligations as well, so that we are adopting a common culture around how we use patents in this kind of environment, and what we do and what we don't do.
Yeah, that's a good segue into my next question. So the 2022 Open UK State of Open report talked about how companies move from only consuming open source to becoming contributors and collaborators. And why don't we talk about the role that an OSPO can play, especially around policies and procedures that these organizations need to move from consumption to contribution? Yeah, you can start, Sammy.
So it's a great question, and I think there are multiple drivers. I think there is acknowledgement that actually there is value in open source, and you have a lot of initiatives. I mean, one of the initiatives that I'm directly involved in, as mentioned, is Open Chain. Open Chain is an initiative that is aimed at building trust across the supply chain. We spoke about the supply chain in the previous panel, building that trust by actually providing consistent sort of license compliance artifacts as software moves across the supply chain. So that when an organization or a company receives open source from a supplier or a developer, they have all they need to make that assessment. Is this going to work for my product commercial product, for example, that I want to utilize? Is it going to be, is there any licensing compatibilities, for example? Is it going to work from a business perspective? Does it do what I need it to do? So, or conveying that information across the supply chain is really critical and improves on efficiencies. Now, the key components of Open Chain is actually to have a consistent policy across the organization, to have a clear process by which a developer knows when they want to use or bring in open source into the organization, what they need to do, who to ask, where to provide guidance. And again, a key thing that I'm a great fan of is education. Without education, whether it is to your exec team, whether it is to governments, whether it is to developers, actually educating people on why you're requiring them to do something, why are you putting a policy in place, why you're putting a process in place, the benefits of doing that is really key. And Dawn mentioned that I led the Open Chain ISO compliance for ARM, we rolled out training to over 5,000 employees across the world. And it was a great success because we were able to have that consistent approach across the organization. And one of the opening statements I used to say is that I'm not here to stop you doing anything. I just am telling you, if you want to do something, here's the policy, here's the process that you need to follow. And interestingly, there is a lot of reactions certainly around governments about being rigid or being, actually our policies and processes are very flexible and adaptable that enables whichever part of the company, whatever type of business you're doing, is to scale up to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. That really is the responsibility, is having that collective of people with clearly defined responsibility, who you need to ask, who is going to help you with that particular request, whether it is a contribution request, whether it is a consume sort of request, what you need to do and how to achieve that.
I think from my perspective, one of the key roles of an OSPO is actually that of facilitator, both facilitating education, ensuring that the various departments and groups within the company have the knowledge needed to contribute, not just consume. Be the facilitator to abstract the management and executive interaction from the developers. They want to contribute to an open source project, they want to create an open source project, okay, fine. We have the discussion, understand their requirements, understand their desires, what they're trying to do. We then go and have that conversation with the various management teams, etc., to ensure that the developers can just get on and do what they need to do. The whole, we advocate the RERO kind of methodology of release early, release often, right? You're never going to get it right first time round, but if the intention is there, the understanding's there, okay, great, let's iterate and keep moving forward. And I think the iterative aspect of open source is something that those that aren't engaged in open source struggle to understand. Because if you're going to release something, it needs to be perfect, it needs to be shiny, all bells and whistles attached to it. Reality doesn't work that way, so we have to keep working on it, facilitating the discussions with the various teams and departments.
Yeah, exactly. So Keith, maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on how OSPOs can help the internal legal teams understand these interrelationships between the legal matters and how they impact an organization's ability to actually participate in open source.
Yeah, if I can, I'll just follow up on what was just discussed by Andy and Sammy. And I think, one of the things, if I look at models, I look at OpenTitan that's being curated by Google right now. And it's Google does a great job of investing the resource and not only capital, but individuals who are truly talented in projects where they want to make a difference. And this is not something that is that common. You'll see projects that come out of organizations that need a lot of work. And Linux Foundation has, I guess Jim talked about it, over 400 projects, I think, that they're currently managing. One of the most successful projects is another project that was originally incubated by Google, which is now it's part of CNCF, but it's the Kubernetes project. I think if we want to have an impact in the community, that there's also this, the OSPO can be involved in helping to ensure that there's thoughtfulness about and a long-term view on how we're going to contribute. Contributions are just not code. They're actually creating well-formed projects internally, incubating them, nurturing them, bringing talented people to them, and then essentially launching them under the stewardship of an organization like the LF or other organizations that project manage, that provide professional management to help bring more investment around, more individuals, large and small companies to be able to work around the project. And I think also to recognize that this is such an egalitarian kind of community. I think we can invent in situ, we can invent where we are, because smart people can come around software problems and solve them from wherever they exist in the world, even before COVID. People were inventing and living where they are. And I think, how do we manage those networks of individuals? Now is even more critical than ever, but that's all part and parcel of not necessarily just the total purview of the OSPO, but the OSPO is involved critically in that mix of how we bring technology to market, how we utilize the project methodology to be able to innovate. And I think that's a really important part of kind of the social dynamic of what open source is. And I think at its core, if we contextualize this, open source is a social movement. It happens to produce technology, but the power of this is the modality, the idea of open collaboration where 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, but equals 6 or 10 or 20 when we bring smart people together and allow them to work on solving problems in software. And so I think if we back up and recognize that and always keep that in mind as our swing thought, we start to really understand that the OSPO is in the center of a space as linkage to the legal department, to the technical teams, to senior leadership in many cases, the CTO's office, the head of software. And it's basically coordinating with the key people who are driving innovation in modern organizations. It's not the way it was. And this is true in hardware as well. We're working a lot on RISC-V to try and find a solution that helps open source hardware have the kinds of protections and benefits that open source software has in terms of patent risk mitigation. And we'd love to see, our OSPOs are our connective tissue with organizations in most cases, because talking to just IP directors doesn't get us where we need to be, because these people are not, in many cases, connected with how the company works. They're connected with, essentially accountants with a different currency. But the OSPO has a very strategic role. If the talented people are put in those roles and they're given freedom to be able to make the connections that need to be made, make recommendations, work with people, and to be able to do this important role that I described of building projects internally and incubating them so that we can have more fully developed or fully fleshed out project teams that are already able to attract lots of investment. There's a reason why the most significant project inside the LF now in terms of energy, number of people attending the annual conferences, CNCF, because it came out flying. It didn't come out limping and needing a lot of support. And obviously the cloud providers in the world are gobbling up that technology and utilizing whatever's produced very quickly.
Yeah, so building on that a little bit, Andy, maybe you can talk a little bit about how we often see an emphasis on code within open source projects, but there are lots of other aspects like community engagement, documentation, and curation that are really important for companies and open source program offices.
Right. I mean, regardless of what open source project you look at, most of them will struggle with the non-code piece, right? It's, generally speaking, it's ones and zeros. That's all we care about. Well, documentation's a key piece, and actually it's a great entry point for people to get into open source, right? I've been on various projects where actually we needed translations, right? Yes, this is before a lot of the automated translation tooling that's out there now, but so we would go out and speak to users. Do you use the software? Yes, okay, great. Would you mind casting your German eyes over this or your Arabic eyes over this and whatever else, right? English is the universal language, unfortunately, fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it. And there's lots of easy entry points for people to actually get engaged, get involved in open source. Use cases, right? Engineers, there's a lot of software that gets generated that the developers have an idea of how they want it used. Quite often, projects are more successful when they're used in areas that they're not designed for or they weren't thought of, right? But we won't know about that unless people provide the use cases. And that, again, you may not be a developer, a hacker, whatever, but there's lots of avenues for engagement there to grow your community, and without, an open source project will not be successful without a community, right? That's what makes it an open source project. Without the community, it's just software. Great, okay. Add in that community component, and then you've got something special. And it's a matter of finding those entry points for people to build that community, provide them with the tooling. An OSPO's role is there to support both internal and external engagement. So for ARM, from my perspective, my key role is to ensure that as much open source software supports the ARM architecture as best as possible, and to do that, I need to ensure that my developers, my marketing team, etc., have the knowledge and tools on how to interact with those wider communities. So it's a two-way education street.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's shift gears just a little bit. So with things like GitHub, GitLab, all these other modern tools, any employee can really easily spin up a new open source project or incorporate open source into your company's products without any conversations with legal, procurement, finance, or even the OSPO. So can you talk about the risks that this poses for organizations and how they can use policies and procedures to help mitigate some of these risks?
So, establishing a policy and a clear process, again, going back to that principle that I said about enabling people to do what they want to do easily. And I put that emphasis on easily because I think if you're asking a developer to adhere to a set of rules, you need to make those rules not cumbersome, make them easy, and explain to them what are the potential risks in them putting a particular piece of code, throwing it over the fence, as somebody mentioned in an earlier panel, without thinking about how are we going to maintain this, who is going to govern whether we take contributions or not, how is the project going to be managed. These are all the good practices and the engagement with the community that you need to think about ahead of just saying, okay, I'm going to create a piece of software and I'm going to put it under a permissive license, therefore I adhere to the policy that we've got in place. Actually, thinking about the project, about part of the assessment, what are you trying to accomplish? What is the objective? What is the goal? How are you going to ensure that the code that you're putting there has the long-term longevity that is needed? And Andy mentioned this briefly around, projects get put out there and then they end up being used in a completely different, innovative way because the technology is evolving around us. So to think about all of these the end-to-end, if you like. And again, I'm a great fan of, I don't know how many people have seen, there is the consume, collaborate, and create. It basically defines the principle that you need to consider what you need to do when you bring in open source software into your organization and how that interacts with your own products, how it's used internally within your organization, and that's becoming more and more critical as security obviously becomes more and more important and issues arise. On the contribute is the bit where how are you going to contribute? What is the project? What code? What quality of code are you going to put out there to the project? Has it been reviewed? Is it adequate? Is it of a reasonable standard that it can go out with the name of your organization? And then the create. If you create your own project, you need to think about what a project requires to be successful. And you need to think about all of the things like what license, is this going to be adopted? How is it going to interact with other projects that it might end up being used with? And also how is the community going is it going to create that collaborative approach in the community? This is really the role of the OSPOs and the individuals leading OSPOs.
Ultimately, it's path of least resistance. A good developer is lazy, right? They're going to take the shortest route to the end game. So if you can make that path of least resistance the right path, you're on a winner there.
So that naturally segues into my final question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. But a lot of the things we've discussed either rely on tooling or can be made easier through tooling. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how tools from groups focused on standards and best practices like OpenChain, there's also the To-Do group, how those can be used by OSPOs to manage a lot of the work within not just the open source program office, but the organization as a whole.
Should I run away now? I think tooling is unfortunately not going at the same pace as the need from developers. I think having been involved in the OpenChain license compliance for ARM, I think one of the biggest challenges is that developers have to use 4 or 5 different sets of tools that are just not compatible with each other, not talking to each other quite, and there's quite a lot of manual intervention. There are improvements, but I think I would argue it's not in the same pace as the level of collaboration, the adoption. Jim mentioned 90% of software is open source today. Actually, the tooling is not going at that same pace as what you would expect. And I personally am a very strong believer. Developers are very busy. They don't have the time to spend on doing sort of 20 different steps to accomplish compliance. You need to make life very easy. You need to have sort of an integrated approach to tooling. So I would say it's not there yet. It's improving. There are a number of initiatives. The OpenChain Tooling Group is trying to provide that sort of end-to-end open source solutions rather than proprietary solutions who are focused on solving specific problems or issues. The pace is not the same. I think we need to have some investment put behind it to enable and facilitate that sort of integration. And again, it's a difficult challenge to solve because no two companies are the same. The development methodology is very different from between company A and company B, but you need to have sort of an adaptable approach to tooling to be able to provide a solution, an easy solution, I would argue.
Either of you want to add to that?
Sure. I think tooling in the market, I agree completely with what Sammy's saying, but I look at tooling in the market and I think, this isn't, unfortunately, the problem's even more acute because we've got tooling that, again, is not compatible, that is not consolidatable. So that you can't have a common platform to be able to use. At this point, I think we've, through many different programs that kind of had false starts and ultimately disappeared, we've had the intention of bringing these tools together and unifying them. It just hasn't happened. Maybe we need more motivation. Maybe we need to work together more. An example of how the companies that work in tooling could collaborate and take a page out of what happens in the open source world to actually produce something that is scalable, that is modular, so that we can load lots of components into it. But I think there's also this notion of corporations. There are at least a dozen corporations that I know that have their own proprietary tools that they developed, especially if you're like IBM has been doing this for a long time and it's a black box. Do they share anything with the outside world? No. And so I think we have a lot of accumulated knowledge that we're not even putting out there because of the race to find the holy grail that actually allows somebody to make money on a proprietary solution. I think we need to put more emphasis into what Shane is doing in OpenChain and Sammy and others have been helping with to be able to find a common open source platform. Why should we be using proprietary tools? And I think this is, I mentioned open source hardware, the same kind of discussion is taking place there. Why should we be using proprietary tools when we want to be able to do hardware, software, co-design, and simulation with great value and effect in terms of market? Why should we be using a non-open source solution to do that? It doesn't make any sense in the medium to long term.
I mean, I think there's one great bunches of things like To-Do Group, OpenChain, and others is the best practices side of things, right? That facilitates and simplifies how an organization should implement, adopt, and curate open source, right? And so that is a great tool to facilitate what the organization's doing. But when it comes to other tooling like, for instance, GitHub, GitLab, etc., there's the view that actually if we can throw in a load of AI, whether it be Copilot or other things, that's going to do everything that you need. That actually introduces a whole raft of additional problems that from a low-level developer perspective, yes, it may facilitate things easier, but from the bigger picture, that actually adds a whole level of complexity that we're only just starting to scratch the surface of. So tooling does need to be balanced quite carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 6 minutes left. Maybe we'll open it up for audience questions. Yes, Cheryl.
Okay, hi. I have a question for Andy.
Yeah.
So for context, I'm Cheryl. I work at Apple. I don't work on the OSPO, but I work quite closely with them. How do you think about the dynamics of an OSPO? Usually OSPOs don't sit within a specific business unit, right? So you have to manage that dynamic between the OSPO and what the business unit's priorities are. How do you try and align those incentives beyond like the education side? How do you try and align those?
So from our perspective, our OSPO is actually comprised of a key stakeholder in each unit, right? So we have people from, we have somebody from legal, we have somebody from engineering, from marketing, from whatever. And generally speaking, there is a lowest common denominator that everyone needs to adhere to, everyone needs to accept and adopt. Great, fine. It may not work for the compiler engineers, but it will work for the middleware engineers or whatever. And then so you need to, again, in true open source fashion, iterate. You need to try and work through, okay, yes, we accept, you're not happy, but if we can get over this hump, then that then facilitates this avenue to move forward. And so it's, in true open source, but you just need to keep moving forward. Don't try and, don't pause and make sure that it's the be all and end all. The issue comes down to when legal steps in and go, no, that's not going to work from a contractual perspective or a licensing perspective, whether it be from an IP piece or whatever, right? There are certain companies will have key triggers that just drops the portcullis from a legal perspective and they go, nope, not interested, right? And so there's that awareness of the key trigger points for the various business groups going through. Actually, the OSPO was at ARM was set up in collaboration between software engineering and legal to try and improve that relationship and that impression that the software engineers had of our legal team, right? And so we then started growing from there, pulling in the other parts of the company, the business groups and marketing and whatnot, so that we could get as wide a purview and wide an influence sphere as possible. Not sure if that's really answered your question though, Cheryl, but it's...
I was specifically thinking about the incentives because often what you hear from the business units is we're busy, we've got other priorities.
Right.
Is there a way to get that beyond like, okay, it's a legal risk if we don't?
I think that the key aspect is highlighting if you don't do something, what happens? What's the impact of not doing? Everyone knows, yes, it's great if it's rosy. If we do this, it's, we conquer the world. Great. But what if we don't do it? What's the impact pulling in, working with other groups to try and highlight that message to the business group, right? what is the impact from the developer ecosystem side of things? What the developer relations guys thinking? What are other business groups? Can they help get your message across to the key stakeholder kind of thing? It's kind of, collaboration across all levels, ultimately at the end of the day to get to that endpoint. But it's not an easy one to quantify when it comes to, this specific business group.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thomas?
So, Sammy, you said the tooling of OSPO tooling, right? I built tooling for OSPO, fully open source. But if I look at it, and to put pretty different, one, building tooling is very, very complicated. But two, if you also look at why we're behind, in reality there's VMware builds one tool, and the German auto industry builds the other tool. The rest of the industry hasn't built literally any tooling whatsoever to help out their little projects. So what do you think is needed to move the needle?
Okay, so just in case people didn't hear the question, I think there are very limited number of contributors to the open source tooling. And I think Keith mentioned that very often many organizations or companies are so frustrated that the available tools have not addressed their needs, they end up building their own proprietary solution. But there is no sharing that back with the community or thinking about how can I build that as a community for the benefit of everybody involved. And I think my answer to that is to put motivations and incentives to sort of say, okay, if you contribute, this project is established, is well funded, and give those motivations to companies why, and also sort of give that education back to them. By the way, you no longer need to maintain this if you participate or contribute whatever solution you have implemented in place. Because again, that is generally an overhead, and particularly where organizations are looking at cost, actually it's much more cost effective to collaborate and to take that sort of approach on just share what you have done. And a very good example of that when we at the early days of the OpenChain project, people were talking about training, and myself and a colleague in the legal department, Jelaine Lovejoy, we actually advocated at donating our training material to the OpenChain project. This was a big, how can we give, the top secret, what we tell our developers? But actually, once we've done it, 20 other companies came and donated their training material. In fact, we ended up with training material sort of coming out of our ears because companies were donating their material. And actually, overall, it was very similar because everybody was trying to solve the same issues. We really need to create that sort of motivation around the tooling with a bit of funding, because again, establishing with that funding, I know, Thomas, we struggle to get motivation, to get developers to help us with the open source tooling. So putting money behind it to actually entice and motivate companies is a really good way forward. And it will get more complicated, by the way. Security is coming our way with the tooling required for security. So license compliance is only one part of the puzzle. As we integrate into security, we'll see in the next panel, that is even more of a challenge.
Okay, we are out of time. So I wanted to thank my panelists for some excellent responses. So thank you very much.